In the island city of Key West, Florida, rests a home with a history of dread and terror. For those just passing by, not knowing what happened behind those walls, it would seem like any other regular house. But in the early 1900s, a family living there would undergo torment for years by the hands of a malicious spirit surrounding the young boy of the family. This spirit would go on to influence and poison the mind of this young boy for most of his life, threatening and attacking anyone who got near. Join me as we discuss the malicious life of Robert the Doll. Welcome everybody to Moonlight Lore. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. Today we'll be investigating the spirit of Robert the Doll. Some of you may know of this spirit being one of the influences for the horror films regarding Chucky the Doll, but unlike Chucky in the movies, Robert is very much real and has quite the story behind him. The young boy I mentioned before was named Robert Eugene Otto, who lived with his family on the island of Key West. As a young boy, Robert was fairly imaginative, creating new games to play with his few friends, and eventually getting an early start on developing a hobby of painting. As most would say, he was a normal young boy living a normal life. There seems to be some confusion as to how the doll eventually got into the hands of young Eugene. Many people stand divided on how Eugene acquired the doll to begin with. According to some, it's believed Eugene's grandfather, who had taken a trip into Germany, brought back the doll for Eugene as a gift. Another theory was the doll was given to Eugene as a gift from the Otto's family servant, who was later caught practicing voodoo on the grounds of the house and was promptly fired. But before she left, she cursed the doll, which in turn would go on to torment the family. Like most though, I'm led to believe the doll was originally made in Germany, sometime in the early 1900s, and was bought and then given to Eugene by his grandfather. And aside from just rumors online, there's really no evidence or support to say their family servant was the one to give the doll to Eugene. At laying first eyes on the doll, one would think it would be harmless, no more than a simple child's toy. It stands at 100 centimeters tall and made up of wood wool. With it being well over a century old, some of the wood wool, which is not very sturdy and is susceptible to dents, scratches, and chipping, has broken away from the doll, giving it the appearance as well worn and well used. It holds a small toy dog in its arms and is dressed in a sailor's uniform. But what most people comment on when they lay eyes on it is its beady little black eyes that almost look like they're staring back into your own. When Eugene was first gifted the doll by either his grandfather or his family servant, he was ecstatic, happy to have a new little friend for him to play with. The little uniform and toy dog it held appealed to his active imagination, and he imagined the doll as an extension of himself. Eugene even gave the doll his own name, Robert, and started to go by his middle name, Eugene. This early on, and we can already see how Robert was able to take over Eugene's life so quickly. At first, everything in the house seemed to be fine. Eugene loved Robert and took him everywhere he went, played with him, and even spoke to him. Eugene's parents, Thomas and Minnie, first found it relieving, not having to watch or entertain their young son all the time, as they would just listen to him talk to his doll and let his imagination run wild. It wasn't until they tried to separate the two of them, and Eugene would throw a massive fit, they would begin to wonder if he was possibly spending too much time with Robert. The pair of them decided to watch Eugene without his knowledge. They wanted to figure out what his fixation on the doll was really about. One day, while Eugene was alone in his room playing with his toys, Minnie walked past the door in the hallway and thought she had heard her son talking to someone. She backtracked a little bit and placed her ear against the door to listen. What she heard was just Eugene humming a tune and occasionally speaking out to someone. Minnie thought nothing of it, and that her son had just made up an imaginary friend out of Robert, and she just turned to walk away. But what she heard next made her freeze mid-step. After Eugene had spoken out, someone had responded back, and in a very deep voice. Extremely worried and surprised, Minnie burst into the room to look for the stranger she knew she had heard. All she saw was Eugene sitting on the floor playing with his toys, and Robert the doll sitting in a moving rocking chair in the corner of the room, staring back at her. Strange happenings only started to escalate from there. With Minnie now on alert for anything suspicious, she and her husband had to decide on what to do. Would they have to take the doll from Eugene, or should they allow him to hold on to it for now and see what else happens? They reluctantly went with the latter and allowed Eugene to continue to play with Robert. As time went on, Minnie and Thomas would often find their son speaking to the doll as if having a conversation with it. On those rare occasions where they would actually hear something respond, they could never catch or figure out where the other voice was coming from. They knew for a toy doll to speak, it would be a ridiculous idea and no one would ever believe them. Nearly every night, Minnie and Thomas would hear Eugene speaking to someone in his bedroom as they tried to sleep. They would be woken up to loud shouting coming from their son's room, and as they would rush to check, they would find Eugene hiding under his blanket or in the corner of the room farthest away from Robert, crying. The yelling continued, occurring almost every night. Minnie and Thomas were at their wits' end. The more they tried to separate Robert from Eugene, the angrier the voice would get during the night, until one night, Minnie and Thomas pushed Robert too far. As the pair were settling down for bed one night, the two could hear the usual sound of talking coming down the hall from Eugene's room. At their wits' end, Thomas suggested to just leave Eugene for the night, as breaking up the two from talking would just make things worse. Minnie, of course, would hear none of it, and went in to check on her young boy before going to sleep. As she walked into the room, the sight before her caused her to step back in shock. All of Eugene's toys were scattered all over the room, torn apart and broken. Furniture was found overturned and wrecked. Eugene was yelling over and over again, "Robert did it, Robert did it," while hiding under his bed covers, shaking. And Robert, still sitting in the moving rocking chair in the corner of the room, staring daggers into Minnie. Things continued to get worse for the Otto family from this point onward. Sleep got to be a rare commodity in the household. Being woken up every night by a mysterious voice and loud crashing of furniture took its toll on all the members of the family. One night, the fatigue got to be too much for Minnie and Thomas, and the pair passed out before checking on young Eugene to make sure he was safe. Sometime in the late night, the two were awoken by more loud crashing and yelling. Only this time, the yelling wasn't the deep voice Minnie and Thomas were used to hearing. The yelling was coming from their boy. The two jumped out of bed and ran down the hall towards the screaming and sounds of furniture crashing. Minnie went for the doorknob, but found it was stuck in place. The door was locked shut. As Eugene continued to scream, Thomas tried pushing and kicking the door in order for it to open, but it still wouldn't budge. It was as if someone or something had piled the furniture against the door. Thomas continued to work on the door as Minnie stood to the side crying, and during one of the pauses Thomas took to get ready for another kick, the two of them heard something coming from down the hall back towards their bedroom. The two turned and looked back at their dark bedroom and listened. The faint sounds of footsteps could be heard coming from their room, and then back inside Eugene's room. They heard giggling, coming from someone who they knew wasn't Eugene. With adrenaline now completely taking over, Thomas was able to make one final kick towards the door, breaking the hinges and splintering the wood. The two worried parents rushed into the room to find it once again completely destroyed, with heavy furniture thrown and toppled around. The only difference from before was Robert. He was now leaning against the end of Eugene's bed, staring at him instead of at the door. It was after this incident Minnie and Thomas knew their son wasn't safe with Robert. They would have Eugene now sleep in their bedroom between them, while leaving Robert alone in Eugene's room. The yelling seemed to stop now that Eugene had no one to talk or yell at, but now the family would often hear small footsteps running around the house and giggling coming from somewhere they couldn't explain. During the days now, when Eugene was at school and Thomas was at work, Minnie would often hear footsteps running around upstairs. When she would go to investigate, she would find Robert sitting in a room he was not left in before. He started to move around the house by himself. Now with the strange activities surrounding Robert happening during the day, things moving to different places from where they were set, Robert disappearing and then reappearing throughout the house, and the giggling and footsteps a constant occurrence, the hired workers and servants of the house would often leave their jobs out of fear of Robert and the house as a whole. Week after week of hiring and searching for new workers started to wear Minnie and Thomas down. Before, workers and hired help were instructed not to talk of what was happening around the house, but now, when so many people were coming in and leaving the house during this time, stories around the community started to grow about the cursed home and the haunted doll to the point where the Ottos weren't able to find anyone willing to take a job there. There's a story of a relative coming to stay at the house during this time after hearing about what was going on and seeing how worn down Minnie and Thomas had gotten. The offer she proposed to the two struggling parents was she would stay with them with free meals and board, and in exchange, she would help around the house and keep an eye on Eugene for them, as she wasn't superstitious and didn't believe a child's doll could actually be causing all the problems she was hearing about around town. After living there for a little while, experiencing everything the house and Robert had to offer, she concluded it was all just Eugene acting out, tricking everybody to get sympathy. Against the warnings from Minnie and Thomas, she convinced them to separate Eugene from Robert and to lock the doll away inside a trunk in the attic. Eugene protested, but eventually relented when the adults told him it was just for a short time to see if anything would change. Later on, when everyone was retiring for the night, everything seemed to be different now. It was quiet, peaceful, and they could feel a weight being lifted. Everyone was looking forward to finally getting a good night's rest. Supposedly, during the night, everyone managed to sleep well with no strange noises heard, no yelling, and no moving objects. The Ottos all woke up in the morning fully rested, but when it was time for breakfast, their relative hadn't come downstairs yet. Minnie decided to go check on her to make sure she was okay and ready to come down to eat. She knocked on the door, but received no response. Thinking she might still be asleep, Minnie crept into the room to wake her up and saw her still laying on the bed. When Minnie approached her, she whispered out her name, but got no movement from her. Minnie got a little more frantic and started to nudge and push her a little to try and wake her up, but found her stiff and not breathing. It was ruled as a stroke due to her age, but the Ottos were skeptical and had a suspicion her death wasn't natural. They decided after a long talk, and after Eugene continuously asked to have him back, to bring Robert back down from the attic and reunite the pair. This story, although very strange, relates to the theme of Robert being malicious and dangerous. Although I was not able to find a credible source to confirm this story, it does help grow the influence Robert has on everyone who meets him to this day, helping create a modern-day legend in the process. As time went on, Eugene grew older, and the Otto family grew to accept Robert as part of their family. Occasionally, Robert could still be heard running around on the second floor, but overall, Robert seemed to have calmed down and didn't terrorize the family as often as he had before. This is to say, Robert was still a doll, which could seemingly move, talk, and act all on his own. I think the Ottos, although still feared Robert, had gotten used to his behavior around the house. When Eugene was gone during the day to school, and Thomas was at work, and Minnie occupying herself with daily chores around the house, Robert could typically be found looking out one of the second-story windows toward the street. Neighbors walking by would often claim they would see Robert staring out of the upper-story window, staring down at them, and some have sworn, as they walked by, they could see Robert's head slowly turning, keeping his eyes on them. Others in the neighborhood would be so afraid of seeing him in the window, they wouldn't even go near the house, and often take the time to take the long way around the house to get to where they were going. As word started to spread and got around the neighborhood of the creepy doll who would watch you as you walked by the Ottos, people soon stopped visiting the Otto home. Thomas and Minnie would often offer invitations to relatives to come stay with them for a visit, though many would refuse because of the doll. The few who would come would only ever stay 1 or 2 nights, as they would claim of being victims to terrible night terrors involving Robert. The years continued to go by, and Eugene had moved away from his home in Key West to study art in Chicago, New York, and eventually moving on to study in Paris, where he would meet and marry another artist, Annette Parker. During this, Thomas and Minnie succumbed to time and both passed away of natural causes, leaving Eugene the deed to his childhood home back in Key West. Knowing his childhood home was waiting for him, Eugene convinced Annette to move to Florida with him to continue their art. Upon arriving at her new home, Annette felt an instant feeling of dread and uneasiness. She felt like a stranger in a new home and felt unwelcomed. Eugene, however, looked past her worry and was ecstatic to be back in his childhood home, seeing the potential and inspiration his open and bright house would bring him in his art. A week after moving their belongings in, Eugene was up in the attic going through some of his parents' old belongings. As he was clearing away some boxes, he came upon a dusty old trunk he wasn't sure he had seen before. Curious, he lifted the latch of the trunk and peered inside. There he saw his old friend, a bit dusty, but otherwise the same as the day when he left home long ago. Eugene rushed downstairs, gleeful to have his childhood best friend back in his life, and went to show Annette, and well, she instantly protested about bringing the doll down from the attic upon laying eyes on it. She said she felt very uneasy being face to face with Robert, and with Eugene pushing for Robert to stay out of the attic, she felt like she was being replaced. Annette relented after seeing how happy Robert was making Eugene and agreed to allowing the doll to stay. Things quickly got out of hand for Annette though, and she regretted allowing Eugene to keep Robert around. Eugene would take Robert all around the house all day, and during the night would prop Robert up in a chair in the corner of their bedroom so he could watch the pair sleep. Somehow, Annette managed to put up with this weird habit Eugene insisted on. But a few nights into this practice, she began to have strange dreams every night, which would then develop into nightmares. She swore she could hear voices and whispers coming from nowhere, footsteps belonging to no one, and household items being moved from where she had last put them. She questioned Eugene about it, but he would avoid the questions by nonchalantly telling her it was probably just Robert, to which she would just brush off thinking, it can't be the toy causing all these problems. Now things were starting to boil over for Annette, when she swore she could see Robert turn his head as she walked across the bedroom, seemingly watching her as she moved. Of course, Eugene defended Robert by playing it down and acting as if it was never a big deal. With this, Annette and Eugene would often get into constant fights, nearly happening every day, as Annette wanted to get rid of the doll, and Eugene defending the doll saying it was his best friend. With no emotion, Eugene would often leave the argument to his favorite room in the house with Robert to paint, leaving a distressed Annette having to stir down by herself, trying to come up with a solution to her problem. Annette would go on to say, Eugene would spend most of his day in his painting room with Robert, only coming out to get food or go to the bathroom. Annette would often say she could hear Eugene talking to Robert as if he was an actual person sitting beside him. Robert had finally gotten full control over Eugene's mind. For the years to come, Annette would stay married to Eugene, fondly remembering the relatively normal man she met back in Paris. Now, with Eugene locking himself away in the upstairs turret room with Robert for hours every day, her family far from Key West, and neighbors still refusing to go near the house due to Robert, Annette truly felt alone. In his final days, Eugene would still spend every hour he could up in the turret room with his childhood best friend as company. As his health slowly declined, it was only a matter of time before death overtook Eugene. Annette found him in the attic, collapsed on the attic floor with Robert overlooking him. Eugene had passed away in 1974 at the age of 73 years old, leaving Annette all alone in the house with Robert. Finally free to do as she wished, Annette moved Robert back into the attic. She loved Eugene, so she knew she couldn't just throw Robert away after knowing how much he meant to him. During this time, things seemed to have died down a bit. Not much was recorded during this time between Eugene's death and Annette living in the house, but eventually, she sold off the house to a new owner, moved away leaving Robert locked in a chest in the attic, and leaving behind one specific rule the new owner must follow and pass down to other owners. never let Robert out of the locked chest. Overall, most who would come to look at the house or stay there would respect the one rule Annette laid out. Most people would find the attic to be a dusty, dreary place anyways, leaving the attic untouched for years. Though of course as things go, Robert eventually found his way out again, and into the hands of a new child to play with. The history of this house online is pretty vague, and so were its occupants. From this point on, the stories of Robert become hearsay, written over the internet, and I honestly can't say if these events ever really took place. We'll just have to take a grain of salt with all these stories, and the events that took place in the house with these families. A small family had moved into the home, and a 10-year-old girl had wandered into the attic looking for toys to play with. As she got closer to the old trunk Robert was locked in, she said she could hear a voice calling out to her, to let him out. She managed to somehow get the lock open, and freed Robert from his prison. It didn't take long before Robert was back to his old tricks again. His temper and displeasure with the young girl started to grow as she didn't show the same respect towards him as Eugene once did. He would tell her horrible things, yell, and threaten her if she didn't listen to him. She ran to her parents crying and saying that the doll in the attic was very mean. And as what most parents would do, they chalked it up to their daughter's overactive imagination and simply locked the door to the attic. Later that night, when the parents were sleeping, they woke up to screams coming from their child's bedroom. The same kind of screams Minnie and Thomas would hear years before. Of course though, the parents believed their daughter was just having a nightmare and sleepily walked to her bedroom to check up on her. When they walked in, they were shocked to see Robert standing over top of her on her bed, as she laid there looking up at him crying. Their protective instincts took over, and the father grabbed Robert, threw him into the attic, and locked the door and hid the key. As you could imagine, none of them got very much sleep that night. The house would come into possession to a few different families, and each one would leave for undisclosed reasons. When a new couple were moving in, they described what they heard was evil laughter coming from the upper floors. They thought maybe they were just hearing things, or maybe one of the children playing outside on the street, and continued to move in. Whenever the couple would go into the turret room, or the attic, they got an unexplainable, uneasy feeling. Rarely would they ever go into the attic, but one day, when the husband was looking for a box they had packed away, he looked into one of the dark corners of the room and saw him. Robert was standing there, watching him. The young couple got a kick out of the creepy doll, thinking it was funny how it looked so menacing, but otherwise unremarkable. They decided to just leave Robert in the attic, not wanting him downstairs, taking up space and creeping out their guests. Robert, of course, didn't like them making fun of his appearance and saying he wasn't allowed in his own home. And one night, when the couple laid down to sleep, they could hear something coming from the kitchen downstairs. They first thought it might have been just a house making noises due to it being fairly old, so they just brushed off the noise and went off to sleep. In the middle of the night, they could feel something crawling up onto the end of their bed by their feet. Thinking it was just their partner stirring in bed, both of them brushed it off to it being the other moving. Then, without warning, they were woken up by an extremely loud, deep voice coming from the darkness of their bedroom. They both shot up in fear thinking someone had broken in, but what they saw at the end of their bed was much worse. With blurry eyes still adjusting, they saw a small figure standing by their feet on their bed, and there sat Robert, staring at them, brandishing a sharp kitchen knife. Screaming, the couple shot out of bed and ran straight out of the house, never setting foot inside again. As I mentioned before, these stories, although they're exciting, fascinating, and help add to the story of Robert being some kind of malicious doll, most likely not even took place. I couldn't find much to corroborate these stories, so for all we know, they're just stories people have made up on the internet to help spread or add excitement to Robert's story. What we do know, though, was that Robert wasn't alone in the house for very long. A woman named Myrtle Reuter had bought the house, along with Robert, and lived there for years to come. During the time she lived there, she confirms the stories similar to the ones plaguing Eugene, though unlike in many of the online stories of Robert, she was able to put up with him and all of his antics. It wasn't until years after living with him, Myrtle decided to donate and move him to his current-day residence, the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West. Robert had seemed to have taken a liking to his new home at the museum. He's able to see and be visited by thousands of different people every year who have come across the globe just to see him. He spends his days and nights sitting inside a glass display case, though this does not mean he can't get up to his old tricks when it comes to harassing people. Those who visit the museum and make snide or insulting comments towards Robert, or even as little as not asking for his permission before taking his picture, swear they could see his face contort into a quick scowl, and when they checked their photo they had taken of Robert, it would come out blurry and useless. But that's not all Robert can do from his glass display case when visitors are rude to him. If you go there, you can find the walls in Robert's room covered in letters of people apologizing to him and asking for forgiveness for taking his picture without asking, or making rude comments towards him. They claim ever since they had left the museum, they've been plagued with bad luck and misfortune. The hundreds of letters tell of people getting dangerously sick, pets dying, losing their wallets or passports, getting fired from their jobs, and even family members suddenly dying. The museum staff have had to start educating visitors when they come to visit Robert on how to act, what not to say, and basically just show common courtesy as if he was a friend. The staff have learned just to let Robert be a lot of the time. During the night when they're about to close up, some staff claim to have heard footsteps coming from down the hall where Robert's display is. Others say when they leave for the night and come back in the morning, Robert would be sitting in a different position than when he was left originally the night before. Even though throughout his story, Robert had been a malicious and troublesome doll, it seems to me he was just a doll who, like us, wants common courtesy and respect from strangers and family. Now he gets to live a life full of attention and never has to worry about being locked away in a dusty trunk or dusty attic ever again, so I think all in all, this story does have a happy ending. The house Eugene and Robert grew up in still stands today too. Visitors and guests to Key West can even find a place to stay there, as it's been turned into a small hotel, where you can book a room in what was once Eugene's art studio and even Robert's favorite room, the turret room. Though if you do stay here, don't be surprised if you see a ghostly figure on occasion. Some say they have seen Eugene's wife, Annette, wandering the halls, or smell fresh pies Eugene's mother was known to bake coming from the kitchen. The story of Robert and Eugene is one of the most fascinating stories known about the paranormal, continuously occurring for over 100 years to the present day. A boy and his doll have grasped the thoughts of people around the world so much, people like myself want to spend hundreds of dollars just to stay at the house where they grew up in and to visit Robert face to face. One day, I hope to find myself in Key West to visit Robert and stay at the artist house to experience the home Robert once called his. But if you do have the opportunity to visit Robert, please show him your full respect. Unless, of course, you want him to cast a curse on you.